Next, presentations, proclamations, and recognitions. We have the presentation by Mr. Doug Carter of DEC Associates and Bart Kreps of Raftelis. As you've seen in the agenda, Doug is working on where we stand now with our wastewater system and some information on the financials of it and how we get over this financial burden. Bart, when did you begin working on our FFE for Oak Island? Yeah. What year?
Probably
2006? Okay. Bonnie's trying to turn the microphone on for you. There you go. Are you going to do the PowerPoint? Okay. That podium has, have we got him set up to do the PowerPoint on the computer?
Yeah, he's on this one over here.
All right. I will turn it over to Mr. Carter and Mr. Kreps.
Could I introduce them real quick first?
Oh, please, yeah.
I'd like to thank Mr. Carter and Mr. Kreps for showing up this evening to help us out. The board remembers that we engaged DEC Associates, which is Mr. Carter's firm, to look at our situation from a financial point of view as far as water and sewer debt obligations. And we have met with him on numerous occasions and talked with him by phone to come up with a plan to address several issues. Number one, sort of look at where we're at right now, how we got here. Number two, the immediate problem that we have in the upcoming budget year in order to meet our bond obligations for the utility system. And then three, and probably just as most importantly, is what do we do from here forward for the balance of the term of our bonds that we have outstanding on the sewer system. So I think Mr. Carter and his son Andrew Carter are going to talk about that. We asked Mr. Kreps to come and talk with us about it, or if anybody has any questions about the rate structure, then he can address those questions as well. This is Mr. Doug Carter over here. This is Andrew, and this is Mr. Kreps. And of course, you know, the lady in the middle is our finance officer, Bonnie Schwerd. So with that introduction, Doug, I'm going to ask you to go on and do your PowerPoint presentation. We appreciate your work on this.
And Doug, while you're going to the podium, I was amiss. I would like to personally thank our finance officer, Bonnie Schwerd. She came to the manager and came up to town hall one day, and she said between May and June of 2013 and then fiscal 2014, we have $17 million of debt service that we've got to pay. We got to figure out a way to pay that debt service. So thank you, Bonnie, for being proactive, looking at what we've got to face, and that was the catalyst for getting in touch with Mr. Carter and also bringing Bart in conjunction with them. Thank you.
We're ready? Thank you, Mayor and members of Town Council. We're happy to be here. This is a multi-page presentation, so I'll take it as rapidly as you want me to or as slow as you want me to. I was raised in Iredell County, so I talk slow anyway. So here we go. First, I'd like to just go over the outline of what we're going to talk about in this presentation. And to start with, let me just talk to you a little bit about DEC Associates and myself in particular, so you'll know something about the background of our firm. DEC Associates is a firm that has the distinction of being number one by volume, a number of transactions and financial advisory work in this state. We work with City of Charlotte on down, and have had the great honor to work on a number of utility projects much like this one over time. Previous to my going into this business, I was Director of Finance for the City of Charlotte for a number of years. I still live in Charlotte. That was a great experience for me and gave me a great way to look at the world and all the things that happened in a city. And before that time, I was Deputy Secretary of the North Carolina Local Government Commission. I went to work for Harlan Boyles. Many of you know that name. He's now deceased, and I'm sorry about that because in many ways I consider Harlan the father of my career. He brought me into government and kept me in it. And as I exited government and went into this business, my consulting and financial advisory practice is exclusively with governments, not-for-profits, and Native American entities. So that's a bit about DEC Associates. I'm going to do a short presentation overview as part of this presentation to simply give you a feeling for what comes next and something about what it all means. We're going to talk a bit about the history of the sanitary sewer project and the creation of the long-term debt that we all know about. We're going to talk a bit about the conditions that created our current financial challenges and the need for solutions to those financial challenges. We're going to talk a bit about the operating budget and the options we have to meet the covenants within our bond documents, the need for ongoing revenue monitoring and rate adjustments. This is not a one-time decision once a year. And then a bit about future actions that could help us with this. And then finally, a little bit of a discussion about long-term solution planning, because as the manager said, our immediate job was to work through the budget process and the needs we had currently, but in a longer-term sense, we're going to work on how do we look at longer-term solutions. And then there'll be a conclusion, and you'll send me back to Charlotte. The overview. I don't think I say, based upon the presentations that have been given earlier, I say surprisingly to anybody that the system has major challenges, and that's going to require both short and long-term financial plan changes and a long-term discussion and looking at how do we maintain this capital asset. How does it operate efficiently, and the cost of that system into the future operate on a positive and affirmative basis. The town management professionals are currently pursuing alternatives to meet the budget. You'll discuss that later on tonight. And I would just say to you, council members and mayor, that I think it speaks a lot to where you want to head to have this open presentation and to sit here and openly discuss where we are and where we need to head. And I just appreciate the fact that you're doing that, and I'm here to answer whatever questions you have, or the others at this table to do that as well. I'd like to say, just as sort of a summary of what we're going to say following into this thing, there are solutions for the challenges. But the big however to this is we need to adopt a pattern of consistency and evenness in how we implement our new financial plan, because there are requirements inside your revenue bond order. When the system was built, you had covenants inside those bond documents, and I think all of us know what a covenant means. It's not a promise. A covenant is an absolute doing. And so, from my point of view, we have a new financial plan that we can pursue, but we have to understand in the final analysis, you made a covenant to pay the bills, and you made a covenant to raise the rates sufficient to pay them. And that was the promise you gave the bondholders. And then finally, I would say on the overview, I'm here to answer questions, as are the other people sitting at this table. And it seems to me, after having spent most of my life in the governmental realm, that a time to ask and answer questions is great for you, it's great for management, and it's great, in this case, for the system ratepayer, since we're talking about the utility system. Now, as I showed you, or as we looked quickly in the overview, the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is the history of the project, at least as I see it in my data gathering over time, the short time we've data gathered, and the significance of the long-term debt. Overall, the project cost and budgets and their various changes and iterations over time, as the project expanded and as there were various parts of the project that had to be changed, basically this process of cost and budget changes created a significant level of debt. That level of debt, when you add current outstanding balances for the debt issued in your name and you're owing to the county, is about $140 million. So that's a lot of money that has to be paid back over the remaining 20-year term of the obligations. The first capital project ordinance that was done for this, and I believe that was probably for phase one of the project, or was it for both phases, Bonnie?
At that point, there wasn't an indication as to whether there was one or two phases.
Okay, the capital project ordinance as adopted in 2004, I'm showing my age here, I'm back to the 19s, was for $57 million. The current estimate of project cost, and we're continuing to evaluate this, both of these numbers exclude the $42 million portion from the county, has grown from $57 million to approximately $130 million today. That is an increase over time of 128%. When the project increases 128% and debt increases with it, along with that comes multiple bond issuances and other sources of funds that came into the project. And frankly, because of the many changes in the budget increases, there was a general concern created over whether or not the capital project's planning and execution was where it needed to be. And in all of that, a delay in time resulted in 3 or 4 years, I believe, Bonnie. There was a number of years in the delayed process. So you put those things together, and we have a large project with a large debt service and a large outstanding debt that you'll be hearing me say several times tonight, we have to pay. The second thing I'll say about history is changing conditions over time have made prior financial planning and rate changes inadequate to sustain revenue bond coverage without significant rate increases now. If we don't increase rates in 2014 and beyond, and we'll talk about that a bit more later, I just don't see any way for you to meet your covenants that you made inside the bond order. I'll talk to you about some conditions that may make that happen, but it would have to be large growth real quick as the primary motivator to get that to happen, and I think we all hope that will happen, but maybe not. It seems to me not only do we have to look at rate changes at the beginning of the year, and you'll see the numbers in a minute to sort of, I think, prove the point, we have to do constant monitoring throughout the year so that we know that we're going to meet our bond covenants at the end of the year. Basically, because of the time delay on the project, loss in growth, other things that I'll discuss in a minute, general economic changes, there was an increased reliance on the assessment revenues in the past to balance the budget, if you will, and that has really kind of created an accumulated need for the user charge increases now. I mean, it accumulated over the years, and this is the year we have to fix it. I'm saying a lot of this in my personal opinion, as you might well guess. Secondly, I would say, as a way to look at how we balance the budget and meet our covenants, in 2010, the bond covenants were not fully met with respect to raising the rates sufficiently to pay the charges. And I think the rule I would say to you is you don't get 3 strikes and you're out in this. You've had your 1 strike, you don't get another one. So in the future, you need to always conform to the covenants inside those bond issues, and I would heavily encourage the current council to do that and believe that you will. Thirdly, I would say from a historical perspective that sanitary sewer assessments were made on a much lower capital cost than any of us ever guessed that it would come to be, and so therefore it produced lower assessment revenues than could have otherwise potentially been available, and that has really, and because here again the system was delayed, that has meant that we've had to use a lot of those assessment revenues. Had we had higher revenues and not had to use them, we would have had other potentials for the use of those assessment revenues, like payoff of debt as soon as we could pay it, which would have created lower cost into the future and therefore lower cost and impacts to the future ratepayers. I would say stop me as you will too, please. I know you're in charge, so you will. Well, that did it. I'll also say from a historic perspective, as I've looked at this, your current levels of outstanding debt create little capacity for future new money issuances. The easy way to say that is your borrowing is gone for a while. You borrow it all you're going to be able to borrow. So we're going to have to make solutions to the current plan that does not include borrowings. Finally, I would say, as part of the historic or the history part of this, future capital improvements funding sources are going to need to be needed and looked at in the long-term plan that I talked about earlier. That will be the next phase to this, because essentially, without a lot of future debt capacity, you're sort of on a pay-go pattern unless we find new sources or other ways to raise money. And so the system is new, but it ages and it changes and it has to be maintained. And if you don't maintain it, its cost of maintenance a year deferred will be higher than it was the year before. So the real important part of this is you have a system, we need to keep it maintained. Now, having looked at the history and how this worked and the project budget and all of that, we are currently, because of changes in capital funding sources that we previously anticipated, we are currently in need of $3.5 million to complete the project and have to identify a source to pay that. Remember, I said to you earlier, we can't borrow it. So we're going to have to find it. And I think looking at how we do that was the first charge on behalf of the manager and the finance director. Let's look at a way that we can accommodate this without impacts on the ratepayer. And you're going to see in a minute, impacts on ratepayers could be very different based upon the approach and the method you used to raise the $3.5 million. Mr. Manager, am I going too fast? Too slow?
I think you're doing fine. Okay. Yeah, so is everybody happy with the pace?
Now, I just hit something wrong and we went the wrong way, didn't I? There we are. Okay, now let's talk a bit about the conditions that created the current financial challenges and the need for solutions. As I said earlier, as part of the history, the capital project cost increases have resulted in extremely large debt payments. Right now, your budget in the utility is in the range of 2/3 for debt service. So it costs you 1/3 to operate it and 2/3 to pay for the debt service. Bart, when I'm off too much on my numbers, throw something at me. But it's in that range. I'm going to constantly give you examples, given that we work for a number of other cities and towns that have utility systems. The highest prior to looking at this that I have ever seen is 50%. Half the budget to debt service and half the budget to operations. That exists in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Utility Department and was driven heavily by enormous growth inside the city and county. The delayed project completion, the customer connections, and the user charge revenue generation produced a larger use of wastewater assessments sooner than anticipated. So bottom line is, as you looked at the initial plans, we would have had more usage, more people on, the system operating more rapidly, more revenues coming in, and retention of a larger balance of the assessment revenues. That simply didn't happen. We have a significant decrease in water usage and inadequate account growth to meet the FF&Es that we were previously looking at and the projections. The original projections assumed that there would be essentially a build-out of the island, build-out of the developable property or parcels by 2017. I'm not sure that we'll reach that. In 2008, as we looked at estimates for usage, actual gallons billed, the estimate ran between 370 and 380 million, hundreds of millions of gallons used annually. The 2014 estimate is 280 by the projections made by the Raftelis group. And while I think there's a good feeling about that number. We're not sure that it's correct. Usage measurement issues remain and are currently being worked on. Because of how the system was growing and changing, the connection of customers, at what intervals inside a year they were connected, and so forth, we really don't have a full year data upon which to base estimates of what usage would be. And coupled with other things that I'll mention in a minute, it just makes it very difficult to make a fully, that you'd hang your hat on projection, I presume. I mean, we're hanging it on this one, but the comfort level would be better if our usage measurement was better. Certainly the economic downturn and the potential for second and retirement home real estate market recovery as a means for increased usage is creating a financial challenge. We simply know what happened from 2008 on. We don't know how rapidly we're going to recover from that, and I think we all see some positive signs, but oftentimes the coming back is slower than the dropping down. So we'll hope for a better way. And then, as I said to you earlier, assessment revenue was lower than the financial cost would have permitted, and therefore that sort of created a challenge in terms of how the revenue worked. Having looked at all of these foregoing challenges, that's why the assumptions inside the FF&Es have not been achieved. They were based on rational points at that time.
Doug, could you, for the audience purposes, tell them what an FFE is?
Right. It's a financial analysis that looks at revenues and expenditures and rate changes and various sensitivities and builds a model that says if the following things happen, here's what occurs inside the rate models and the rate increases that are necessary to meet your revenue bond covenants. Was that too long an answer? And I was raised in Iredell County schools, too. So all of these challenges, as I said, have created the issues that we now deal with. Okay. Here are other conditions that create financial challenges for us, and these need to be solved, I think, as quickly as we can. First and foremost, and to me a big one, we simply need to adopt and implement policies for collection of what is owed to you. Our collection percentages need to be higher. And in a user system where all users pay to support the operating and capital cost of that system, everyone needs to pay. And so I think and see as one of, the longer term solutions that we need to look at is we need to move rapidly towards the look at collection policies and how quickly and how rapidly we collect our revenues.
Doug, while you're talking about that, Steve, if you wouldn't mind review the new policy that all utility bills must be paid in full.
We're working on a policy currently that we're wanting to implement probably in the next 30 days. But we're going to have to stop taking partial payments on water bills. This has contributed substantially to a very large debt that we're going to have to collect. I think, as the board remembers, we had around $720,000 worth of outstanding water bills and payments from several years ago, starting a number of years ago. And we're going to have to go ahead and make some pretty tough decisions. The board's going to have to help me adopt some new policies. That's going to have to, and one of the main driving forces of this is the partial payment. And I just want to thank you for mentioning that. But one of the things that we're going to have to do, or one of the problems that's resulted is if you have a $135 water bill and you come in and you say, well, I got $20, you hand that over to leave your water on, and then next month that problem is still there, except it's even worse the next month. So we're having to address that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just to clarify, that it's not that we'll stop taking partial payments, it's that we'll stop leaving the water on if they make a partial payment.
Bonnie wants me to make sure, say we're still collecting money, but it's just an issue of leaving the water on with outstanding balances. And this is something the board has taken an aggressive approach. We have engaged a collection company to go after the $720,000, but due to the audit and a number of things, there's a bunch of financial information that we have to provide them before they get started. And I think we're on the cusp, aren't we, Bonnie, of being able to do that. So it's not that the town's being mean or wanting to cause anybody any undue hardships. It's just a matter of financial responsibility, and this is what we're going to have to do. Thank you, Mayor.
The second one on this page that I would refer you to that I think is very significant is we've had pretty considerable staffing changes inside the finance and other departments. And when you are engaged in a collection and accounting process, when changes occur in staffing, that always has a major impact on what you do next. Obviously, there is a great need for improved technology and system software. So there is a great deal of human resource and technology resource need that's necessary in order to manage a system this large with this level of debt service. Obviously, you have new city management, and all of us are part of the process of dealing with people who are new. There is the need, the current big challenge is the need to find the final funding source for the capital budget and fill our current gap. And then finally, as I said earlier, finding a way to meet future CIP needs. I would say one final thing to sort of put a bow around this final part of the challenges and solutions is they exist, but we have to do them inside the borrowing covenants and sound business practices, and I think that's what we're going to outline for you later. I'll give you one other thing as we look at, just because I'm a numbers person, I'll give you one other statistic that you can think about for a minute. If you look at the number of customers in our system and the debt that we have for those customers, including what we owe the county, we owe more than $17,000 for each customer. As an example, the utility system in this state that is the largest and has the most debt, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's utility department, their per customer debt is less than half of that. As one rational way to look at how big is the number that we have to cover through our budgets. Okay, now I guess to the meat. Oops, wrong way. Okay, now what about the 2014 operating budget revenue raising options? We have two revenue raising options that have to be settled. Two, and I want to make it as simple as I can. We have to fill the $3.5 million funding gap. That's a capital item. And we have to, using the data that has been developed inside the financial models, we have to adjust rates as necessary to meet at least our minimum covenants and give ourselves a teeny bit of cushion. And so I want to give a little precursor to that and then give you what I think would be our recommendation to you. First, the current assessment revenues that are still accumulated, of which there's about $4.5 million in that range, those revenues are necessary to stay inside the system so that we can pattern the rate increases and use some of those assessment revenues to relieve that blow, if you will, or that impact through the next 3 years' time period. And so the use of that assessment revenue money would really be an abatement process that would help us get to a process of more reasonable rate increases after the third year. And so we can't spend the same money twice. So we either have to spend it to work inside the rate model, or we have to spend it to pay the capital item. I'm strongly on the side of let's leave it inside and help us with the rate models for now. The prior user rate increases were not planned at a level to diminish the current need for the assessment revenues, but that source ends in 2020. In 2020, the money's gone. And so we have to develop a system so that we can make it work without assessment revenues. Obviously, we've got to look at how they will be replaced into the future, and that's all part of the plan that we're going to look at on a longer-term basis. Secondly, as I said earlier, we cannot use the assessment revenues, which is why our recommendation not to use them to fill the gap for the capital budget without having an enormous impact on the immediate rate increases. And then finally, borrowing's not available. I said this to you in the introduction. You borrowed about what you can in this utility system for now. We explored that broadly. We've had conversations. We talked with others about this. It's the best means to do it internally and to say from a capital project and financial plan, we can do it ourselves. And so with that as a basis, the current recommendation is that we temporarily lend primarily from the occupancy tax fund, although a bit from the general fund, the $3.5 million that's necessary to complete the project funding and pay that back out of user fees beginning in 2014 and taking 10 years to do that, to diminish, if you will, that impact. Whoops. Now, just to give you or show you, I think, why we have recommended essentially what we have, let's look at the three that we have.
Excuse me, Doug. I'm sorry, Steve, Bonnie, do we still have option 2? He'll explain. Okay.
First, we could use the currently accumulated assessment revenues to pay the $3.5 million. The one I said don't do, but you could. Just my recommendation. If we did that, in order to meet the covenants inside the bond order, we would have to have an immediate 36% increase in rates across the board. I just don't see that as an option for now, personally. That is up to you as the policymakers, but it seems to me that that would not be the first one. Now, the second one that we explored, that's still a potential, but it would have to be worked through the budget process, if you will, is essentially use money out of the general fund, if you will, to work on providing sources for that repayment. And if you did that, that would mean as of 2014, the rate increase would be approximately 10%. And I'm going to say this now because it applies for the next two options, and that would have to take place for each of the next 3 years. And then the third alternative, which is the one that seems the most, in my opinion, the most viable, is essentially you keep inside the general fund the money that's created there and manage and budget for it in a way that you see fit, and you let the utility system pay back the loan out of the funds that we just addressed over a 10-year time period. And in order to achieve that, it would require an 11.75, an 11 3/4 rate increase for 14, 15, and 16. Now, if that is assuming that our consumption and usage and other underlying and viable economics, if you will, hold true. If growth was better, that could be impacted to the positive. If growth were the same, it should remain the same. If growth were slower, obviously, that will have to be looked at every year.
Doug, if I might add.
Yes.
On the second, there was a question from the mayor just a moment ago about the second option. We did not recommend the second option for the reason that when talking with the local government commission and as we began to talk about these options, one of the things that they pointed out to us was that we could not use our general fund ad valorem dollars to assist with system revenues within the enterprise system. We are allowed to use general fund contributions to a capital project, but it would somewhat be a dance if we were to attempt to perform number 2. And so therefore we felt it was more appropriate to go with a straightforward method of funding in our recommendation to the board.
Exactly. Well stated, Bonnie. And as I said earlier, would leave that money inside the general fund.
Question, Doug.
Yes, sir.
The 11.75% increase over the next 3 years, is that an additional 11.75% every year for 3 years on top of what they would be paying now?
That is correct.
Okay.
Cumulative.
I just want to clarify that.
That is correct. After that time, and this may come up later, but after the third year, using current assumptions, that rate increase would drop significantly to approximately 3% a year, assuming the underlying assumptions were correct. So it's going to take a 3-year period of significant rate increases coupled with the use of the remaining assessment revenue we have in accumulated cash to get us to a point where we can get to more to lower rate increases.
Quick question. You say the first 3 years, approximately, assuming 11.75%, after that about 3%. How many years were you seeing the 3% the 10 years after that?
In terms of the projection in the model, we carried the 3% out all the way to the end of the model, which goes out past when the assessments fall off, which was
past
projected
2020?
to be fiscal year 2020.
Okay.
Now, just to give you, though, so you'll understand what happens after 2014 if we do 11 3/4, even with that rate increase, the budget, or if I should say it right, the operating budget will still be balanced with over 36% of the revenues coming from non-operating sources, assessments, district fees, other things that are not a direct charge to the customer based upon their usage. Under accounting regulations, if you will, and practices, operating revenues, everything that's considered an operating revenue, the fees you set collected off of fixed charges, consumption, and things of that nature, is the most reliable and controllable by you revenues, and every system should work hard to make that 36% number lower. And over time, we will make it lower as we implement these rate increases.
Doug, I think it's important to realize here too that this is a bare bones bottom line, and Bart, if you'd like to address this, that you can. This proposal that we're coming up with.
Exactly.
This is something that is just going to barely squeak us by.
That's correct. In fact, the next point really gives the economics or the matrix on that. If we do this based upon current assumptions, basically, if we put the 11 3/4 rate in, use a portion of the assessment revenues to balance the budget, we would produce 1.05 coverage when the requirement inside the covenant is 1 time. So basically, we're not producing double the money for the coverage. We're barely producing over what the coverage amount is. And you're going to hear me talk about in a little bit what we got to do to make sure that we don't fall below the 100. So that's really how tight it is. So having said all of this, this proposal would meet both needs. One, it would fund the $3.5 million, pay for it out of the system revenues over a 10-year period, and maintain a rate increase over a 3-year period that's manageable to get us to a level so that we sustain 3% increases thereafter. All based upon the veracity and accuracy of the projections. If we're off on the wrong side, it could be more. If we're off on the good side, it could be less. We really won't know that until we've got a good deal more accumulated data on usage and things of that nature. Okay, now here, if we do this, let me tell you the other thing that I just see is very, very important, and then I'll be winding this down for you. But bottom line is the way the bond documents work and your covenant as an elected body works is you have to, by the end of the year, produce the coverage minimums. Projection is 105 at the lowest measure on a one-time minimum requirement. If you, halfway through the year, have estimates of systems cost and usage that aren't going to get you to 1 time, then you're going to have to change rates. And I can give you an example. The 2 largest utility systems in the state, Charlotte-Mecklenburg and the Raleigh City system, within the last 3 or 4 years, both have had to make interim year rate changes because of excessive water, too much rain, and therefore they weren't pumping enough water. So the bottom line is this is when you're at a 105 coverage projection, you are so thin, as I would characterize it to you, that you have to monitor on a quarterly basis where you are with revenues. And indeed, if you are going to be short on revenues, you'll need to make some interim adjustments. And I think that basically sort of covers points 1 and 2. We have addressed to you several times how assessment revenues have bridged the gap, and basically we're using them to help do that now, but we need to have lower and lower dependency. And then one final thing I'll say to you, which is so heavily based on meeting your coverage, is your system fund balance levels really need to grow. You need to increase your fund balance levels out of your excess revenues. When you produce coverage, it means you pay operating costs, you have debt service, and you produce some revenues that are over the debt service level, right? So it throws off cash at the bottom. And that cash would provide you a great source to do some pay-go capital improvements and to increase your fund balances into the future. What could happen in the future that would improve this? Increased usage and improved economics. That is the biggest driving force inside these revenue assumptions, is usage. If usage changes, the economics change. Second, if 2/3 of the budget is debt service, what can help you there? Refundings, potentially. But your first refunding is too far out because the bonds were issued in 2008. They're not refundable until 2018. This is 2013, and so we've got a ways to go to be able to refund those bonds. But we will keep our eyes on the potential to refund those bonds, and as soon as it is highly economically advisable, we would do that. That would give you long-term help. Extraordinary sources to retire debt.
You got some?
Well, you know, you hope for some. Negotiate with the county. Ask the legislature to help you. I mean, I'm just throwing things up. But the bottom line is I think we always have to have our eyes open. Are there ways, are there extraordinary ways that we can make this work? And then I would say we got to continue our prudent budgeting and spending for operating costs. I haven't had a great deal of time to look at the operating budget, but I would just encourage all of you to make it as lean and mean as you can. But you do have an asset. I'll say this one final time on utilities compared to general government. When you run a utility system, if the system isn't operating efficiency, you don't produce enough revenue. So it's always a business decision. Do you have enough operating costs to operate it proficiently and therefore create the greatest level of revenue? And so it's always a balancing act of what is the right amount to produce the greatest levels of revenue. And of course, chief among those is maintaining good customer relations and a whole lot of other things, and keeping your system modern, up to date, and maintenance at the proper levels. And then there's potentially other actions and events. I just think we're also keyed in on what can we look for in the future to help us, that's sort of our number one proposition after the 2014 budget. You can do the best you can. I think the bottom line of my note is a number of them are outside your control, so you just have to deal with them.
Thanks.
As they come. Now, long-term planning, and then I'm sort of out of here to get to your questions. We need to move to the next level of financial planning. What happens after this year? How do we look towards refundings? What are the potential alternatives for repayment? How do we look for create plans and strategies for some of the previously addressed measures, like how do we better measure usage? How do we collect all our money as fast as we can collect it? All of those things still need to be done. As the manager said, he's in the middle of some of those now, but that's the next thing that needs to be done so that we can essentially get the system operating on as efficient a basis as possible. And at some point in time, we need to evaluate the assessment process and any changes that may be needed to that. I mentioned to you earlier, I'm certainly not at this level advocating it, but I'm simply saying that a good use for assessment revenues, if we had other ones, would be to pay debt off into the future as soon as we could pay it. So I just think there's a number of these things that we need to really focus in on once we get past this planning time period. And
Mr. Foster, Mr. Carter, and Mr. Carter, why don't you guys kind of lead and just ask the council members if they have the questions, and you guys preside over that. Jeff, do you have any questions that you would like to ask?
One of the things you did say is we were going to have to get tougher on our budget. Is that overall budget, general budget?
Well, I have not looked at your general budget. I have concentrated on the utility budget, but I would just say theoretically in general, tight budgets are probably a good thing.
Just a quick question, and I think this is pretty simple, but you mentioned the term PAYGO 2 times, and it's without new debt capacity, that PAYGO or grant funding, if available, would be the primary source for capital improvements. And I think that probably means you have to pay for it. Pay as you go, is that what that means? Okay, I just thought I'd clarify that for the...
Yes. Yes, and thank you. And let me say how you would primarily generate pay-as-you-go, now the abbreviated PAYGO, is if you don't get grants or you don't get a gift from somebody, then basically you produce excess cash by coverage. So if coverage is more than one time, that throws money to the bottom line. And then you would determine whether or not the money at the bottom line was sufficient to take a portion of it and budget in your capital budget. Many people in the utility business set policies for the level of fund balance they want to maintain, and then in any given operating year, if you exceed that by the production of your coverage, it goes automatically to PAYGO in the budget. Pay as you go. Mayor, could I clarify one other thing that the manager has mentioned to me? I used, in discussing the $3.5 million need to fill the funding gap, I just want to make sure everybody knows that that is not an increase to the project budget. That is a method to replace a source that we do not now have that went away. So it basically does not increase the budget. It fills the gap for a source of funds that's no longer with us.
Cash flow. I believe in the FFE, the financial feasibility evaluation, the projected. I believe that we have a certain amount projected into upcoming years for possible capital needs. These rate increases have that built in, maybe $300,000 to $500,000 each year, something like that. If you could walk up to the podium.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we got it now. Yeah,
okay,
we're good.
It's working, Bart.
Y'all are about as good at technology as I am.
We do have funds built in. Now, initially, they are pretty low, as you had mentioned. I think we initially started about between $300,000 and $500,000. I'd have to look and see what it is exactly. Obviously, Doug had mentioned the coverage is very thin, particularly in 2014. So that doesn't provide a whole lot of cushion to do capital expenditures or PAYGO capital. As you move forward with the cumulative rate increases, it does provide some more flexibility. And longer term, we did build in some assumptions of that increasing over time up to a level that's more sizable, and recognizing that over time, this asset is going to depreciate, and you will have to start reinvesting in the asset. So that is built into the forecast. Obviously, it depends on what occurs over time to determine exactly what that level is going to be, but there are funds built in for that purpose.
Okay. Council Medley,
You done?
please. And you're allowed more than one question.
Well,
If
that's what I
anybody
was
comes up with
wondering.
one they want to ask, please feel free.
Doug, you may not be able to answer this question, but if you can, I'd appreciate it. In looking at what you've looked at, I know you've taken a pretty serious look at the whole project. Was there a given period of time where the costs seemed to escalate and, so to speak, get away from us?
Well, let me just say this, because Bonnie looked at this and we talked about this today. In '04, the project ordinance was for $57 million. In '06, it went to $65 million, and in '08, it went to $107 million. And so it was somewhat consistently going up over a time frame, although the adjustment between '06 and '08 was larger than the adjustment for the previous 2-year period. So it's just really hard for me to say because I haven't had a long enough time period to look at it or think about it. But the ordinances were going up every 2 years from 57 in '04 to 107 in '08.
The period of '06, really '07, '08 is when it really escalated.
It went up $50 million.
Yeah.
Now, those numbers are exclusive, as I said earlier, Mr. Council Member, of the money that was in the county portion, the $42 million. This is town side only. If we had not lost, and my memory doesn't serve me correctly, I don't think it was a $3.5 million revolving loan fund.
$3.88 million.
$3.88 million revolving loan fund from the state. If we had not lost that, we would not be borrowing this $3.5 million from ourselves right now. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Council Kaiser, no?
Don't have a question.
Council Royal.
One thing that I think it would be helpful, Doug, if you can help our citizens to understand, I think most folks, particularly those folks with vacant property, and maybe a good majority, overwhelming majority of people who are hooked on the sewer and are utility ratepayers, think that the sewer assessments that they either have already paid or are paying went exclusively to pay down debt. And so that has not been the case, and to help us to understand why that, what's happened with that and how that is impacting what we're having to do now, particularly with the sewer district fee.
That's a good question, and let me try to articulate it in this way. At any time that you include an assessment revenue as part of the operating budget as a way to meet your coverage, that budget contains operating, and as we said earlier, significant amounts of debt service. So technically, the assessment revenue would have paid some sort of share of the debt service, just as it paid a share of the operating cost. So there's no question that assessment revenues were there to help pay debt service, but they haven't been there to call the debt down and lower it when it comes time to call it, if you will, when you could pay the debt off. So it was there helping make annual debt service payments, but it was not being accumulated, as an example, so that when the 10th year passed and you could call the debt and pay it off, that it was in the bank to do that.
Mm-hmm. Right. But even on an annual basis, I guess it depends on how that is allocated, that some of the sewer assessment has been used not just towards debt service, but also towards operating expenses.
Yeah, if I could address that question. I think, if you look at the projections before, one of the biggest things that's impacted that is the delay in the construction of the system and getting people connected to the system and being able to charge people user charges. Because the forecast always assumed that this system would be up and running well before it actually is up and running. And to date, I don't think we have everybody connected to the system at this point. So it's predicated on being able to charge customers user fees. The reality is, since there's delays in connecting customers to the systems, the user fee revenue is not there. You had to use wastewater assessments to supplement that. Well, the way the forecast contemplated the use of those assessments previously was that we would have them available in the future to defer for coverage purposes. Right. Well, once you use them up, you can't use them for coverage and future purposes. So by far, that was the biggest implication in terms of the model, is just getting the revenue stream up. And on top of that, you have consumption that's down by 25%, right. And you have an account base that's basically stagnated. If you look at, when we first started doing the forecast, for the feasibility evaluations, if you looked historically, the town had been growing at a rate of about 3% a year for the last decade. Well, obviously, when the financial crisis hit, that stopped abruptly. And I don't think the accounts, there may have been minimal adjustments in accounts in what we've seen, really over the last 5 years. So you take that away, you reduce your economies of scale, that means your rates have to be higher. It's pretty much as simple as that.
Thank you.
And Bonnie, may I ask, I think we started bringing people online in 2010. The first assessment was June of 2010. The 2011 and 2012 years, did we run in an operating deficit for 2011 and 2012, or do you know? Yes, ma'am. We did.
There was an operating deficit last year.
About $2 to $3 million.
There was an operating deficit in excess of $3 million in fiscal year 2011, and right at the same for 2012.
Okay, so built into part of this is an attempt to recover from the operating deficits of the prior fiscal years. And as you said earlier, 2013 is the very first full fiscal year. Everyone has been charged for the minimums, correct?
And in fact, everyone's still not being charged. There's still a few that are not yet having sewer available to them. Right. So until that's complete, we're still not at full capacity.
That's 25th West.
Yes, ma'am.
And then that one guy on Yacht Drive. Okay.
Customers. But
Mr. Foster.
I was just going to say that one of the things regarding these assessments I'm personally kind of not clear on is that typically under 168-266, you assess at the close of the you assess the total cost of the project, and I'm not sure of the history about how I've talked with the former mayor about this, how this $4,200 original assessment came to be. And typically, I think, as you guys are talking about, that you would use some of this assessment money at a higher rate used toward paying your debt service with. Well, it was put at $4,200, and I guess the rest, Bart, was supposed to be taken care of at normal rate increases over that period. But there was some question about how they arrived at that amount and kept that amount, during that period of time. I wasn't around, I don't know, but that was just a question that came up. And I think that had some impact, down the road on.
Dara, I believe you were on council in 2004 when they set the assessment at $4,200.
I was, and I can tell you three numbers that converged to be about that amount. One was some estimate that had been done that put a $42 million price tag on a collection system, whether that was, and I think the question was raised earlier about what some of these estimates may have applied to, whether they were split in phase or really looking at the total system. The other number that was close to that at that time was what the impact fee was for connecting to the Fish Factory Road system for a new user. And the third thing that was in that ballpark was what it cost to put in a septic system. And so all those things kind of converged in terms of what people's ability and willingness to pay in terms of an upfront cost. That was continued and not changed in the future, in subsequent years, because all of the FFEs that were done showed that amount could still make the system debt payments work, and it was felt that most people, particularly after the economic downturn, would be in a better financial position to pay a little bit more each month than to pay some large lump sum again, even over a 10-year period. So, and if it wasn't, if it was paid over a 10-year period, you still wouldn't be getting the revenue flows potentially that you would need to meet the rate covenants and have the over coverage when you're coming towards the end of the life of the bonds and the age of the system, where you need those capital funds to continue to start reinvesting in the system again.
So the assessment wasn't really based on based completely and totally on the cost of the construction. There were other factors.
In other words, the assessment had, in other words, the construction had to at least cost that, but there was not, at least as I understood it, there were certainly some people who looked at that and thought that could and should be used to pay off the system. But as I understood it, yes, the assessment is based on what the collection system is going to cost, but not to cover, that would be over the course of time would be a combination of paying off the debt service would be a combination of using the assessments and a portion of the utility rates.
Okay.
But there was very little reliance in those initial FFEs on using the sewer district fee.
Any other council member have any other questions, please?
Well, I don't have a question, but I'll just make a comment. Where we are, the budget that we're talking about and the fees for this year are applicable to Oak Island customers, whether they're served by the new sewer system or whether they're served by the Fish Factory Road system, which last year at budget time we were talking about a rate restructure and the establishment of a sewer district fee that would be different for the Fish Factory Road customers than for the new system customers, based on the amount needed to repay the remaining debt in the Fish Factory Road system. So we, I think the majority of us on council thought that the rate restructure that was proposed at that time was made rational, economic sense, and was fair. And the only problem being that our billing system couldn't handle two different sewer district fees. And we were basically stating then that that would be corrected as of this time. And it's not corrected this year. And so that is still, I believe, an issue, an open issue that needs to be recognized and hopefully remedied in the future.
Well, we have been, for the past 12 months, well, 18 months, David Kelly, Utilities Director, Bonnie, Steve, and I have worked with Bart. We have continually worked on that rate restructure proposal and fine-tuned it. But as Bart and Doug said a while ago, we can't depend on those estimates. They mentioned probably 280 million gallons a year, and I developed that number by going through all the way back to '09. But the data is useless coming out of the software package we have. So if we missed on that 280 million gallons, that 05 would be a negative 05. We would only be at 0.95. Correct?
Yeah, I can provide some comments here as well. I think the broad takeaway is absolutely, we've looked at different rate structure options, theoretically, and perhaps down the road that could be a solution. But the primary importance right now is revenue sufficiency. We don't even have 1 full year of a full revenue stream coming out of the utility. Fiscal year 2013 is the only year where we're getting close, but we're still not even there yet. And the one thing I would say about rate structure changes is anytime you change the rate structure, you're injecting uncertainty into something. There's already an awful lot of uncertainty, related to the entire development of the system, because you have to remember, we're developing a utility system from scratch, essentially. And it's very hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. So, our thought on that was, let's get the utility revenue stream up to a point where we're more comfortable that it's self-sustaining, and then you can explore options related to rate structure, because if you do start changing that rate structure, that's an additional element you have to deal with. So that was our perspective on it.